Hey, welcome back to another RC Worst video. Today we're going to talk about 5 reasons that you don't need a grinder pump. But before we get into what the reasons are, I just want to take just a minute and talk about what grinder pumps are used for the most part. So on a fairly routine basis, the phone rings and I pick it up and there's a customer that's fed up with their sewage pump. Your pump's becoming clogged, or it's not keeping up with the capacity, whatever the reason being that you're no longer happy with your sewage pump. Maybe you've had to replace it a handful of times since you've lived in the house, and it seems like people get to this point where all of a sudden they feel like they need a grinder pump because their sewage pump has failed. Or oftentimes people will just confuse the term grinder pump for sewage pump when they actually need a sewage pump. So I pretty regularly will get a phone call where somebody says, yeah, I'm fed up with my sewage pump and I want to put something in there that's going to be able to chop and slice and dice all that stuff up so that my pump's no longer going to get clogged and I won't have to pay to buy a new pump ever again. And that sounds like a good theory. You would kind of envision that as being the ideal solution where everything just gets chopped up real fine and pumped and you never have to worry about it again. But the reality is grinder pumps, the blades on them become dull over time. And so really the best practice is to avoid putting materials into the application or into the basin or wherever it's being used that are not designed, or those pumps are not designed to handle those types of materials. So it needs to specifically be human waste as well as toilet paper and the regular things that you find in sewage. The biggest killer of grinder pumps as well as regular sewage pumps or really any other pump out there are obstructions that the pump are not designed for. In a grinder pump case or a sewage pump case, those obstructions generally are condoms, feminine hygiene products, and the quote-unquote flushable wipes. Those are not flushable. Do not put them in the toilet. They go in the trash. And if it's so bad you can't throw it in the trash, take it out back and burn it. Because you never want to flush that kind of stuff down the toilet. Stick to what is naturally coming out of your body as well as the toilet paper. So I beat that to death. On to the next point. Okay, so before we get into why you don't need a grinder pump, let's just talk a little bit about when a grinder pump is applicable or when it's a good time to use it. So generally speaking, grinder pumps are used to macerate solids, chop, slice, and dice, like I said, and pump them in most instances to what we call high head applications. Now high head could be one of two things really. It could be either you've got a long ways up that you need to lift the waste and a traditional sewage pump just doesn't have the capacity to do so because sewage pumps, I'm getting off on a tangent, sewage pumps are extremely inefficient because the huge area inside the volute in order to prevent them from clogging or plugging. So a grinder pump, you get rid of that efficiency by chopping everything up and you're able to have a much smaller area and you gain efficiency and thus head. So anyways, back on topic here. With grinder pumps, when you've got that high head scenario or you've got what they call a pressurized sewer line, so the sewer line that you're discharging into is has pressure because other people are pumping into it, or perhaps it's a line that's flowing downhill and you need to be able to overcome the pressure above you. So there are certain circumstances where a grinder pump is an absolute must. But for everything else, it is the opposite of what you want. So one interesting thing to know about how grinder pumps fail before we get into this list of 5 reasons is that they fail because they become clogged. Like I mentioned, the cutter becomes dull with time and it becomes clogged. But another common failure that you can see on even a brand new grinder pump is when you get some material like a string or some stringy type material that is going into the pump, and then right as it passes into the opening of the pump cuts off because the pump is done pumping. And when you happen to get a material that's partially in there blocking the blade as it's trying to come around, normally under a clean scenario where what you would have, or not a clean scenario, but a situation where the pump is going to do what it's supposed to do and potentially pass this piece of string or material, is the blades are spinning, chopping around, and then the material goes up, comes in contact, and it hits it because it has that momentum, it has that weight, it's already moving. But at the same time, if you have a material that stops up against the blade, the next time it goes to start, it doesn't have that speed, it doesn't have that momentum, so it can't get through that material, and then the start capacitor, which is where all the torque comes from, gets burnt up because that extreme amount of current, because the motor's trying to spin but it can't, essentially turns into heat and destroys that capacitor, and then you have big problems because now all the torque is gone, and even if you clear the obstruction, put the pump back in and turn it back on, the very next piece of material that comes in contact with it when it's not fully up to speed is going to start that pump or stop that pump every time thereafter. So it's basically time for a new pump. And grinder pumps are like $1,000, $2,000, not something that you want to consider disposable by any means. So now, what you've been waiting for, the 5 reasons you don't need a grinder pump. Okay, so number 1, they are prone to clogging, which is oftentimes contrary to what everyone thinks about grinder pumps, because of course it's going to hack and slash and chop, dice and slice, but the reality is a grinder pump is more prone to clogging or plugging than almost any other type of pump out there, because it's intended to receive materials, unlike a screen or an open intake where it's meant to pass it. So these are very susceptible to clogging, more so than almost any other pump I can think of. On to number 2. So if a grinder pump becomes clogged even once, the pump is likely ruined. That's not good news, everybody. When your pump is highly likely to become clogged, and if it gets clogged even once, it could be destroyed, that's a good reason not to buy one. On to number 3. Did I mention grinder pumps are also very expensive? So when you add up the fact that they're likely to plug, and if they do plug, they'll get destroyed, replacing them is not going to be easy on your wallet. So make sure that you take that into account. On to number 4. So grinder pumps also have a high energy cost associated with them for the amount of pumping that you actually get out of it. So compared to a sewage pump, a grinder pump only does about a half horsepower worth of actual pumping. The rest of that energy is reserved for the grinding or cutting application. So essentially, one way to look at it is you're paying about 4 times as much for electricity with a much higher risk of running into problems if you're using a grinder pump in a situation where you shouldn't. Number 5, a short life. Grinder pumps oftentimes suffer from what I like to call grinder pump years, which is like dog years but exponentially shorter. Because grinder pumps typically only last a few years. They have hard working conditions, they run hot, they're inefficient, and they like to get clogged and plugged. So in a lot of situations, they only last a few years. And kind of the common tip that we tell everybody who has a grinder pump is limit what goes in the toilet, and you're going to greatly extend the life of your pump. But that's always the one thing that people struggle with is what goes in the toilet. You know, you have company over, things like that. It's hard to control what other people flush down your system. So in conclusion, when it comes to grinder pumps, there's a whole lot of reasons why you should never have a grinder pump or even consider a grinder pump if you don't need a grinder pump. And if you need a grinder pump or someone tells you that you need a grinder pump, question it, make sure to follow it all the way through and determine that that is in fact what you need. Because like I said, there are situations where grinder pumps are unavoidable and they're the only piece of equipment that's going to allow you to have that sewage system in that particular location configured that way. So grinder pumps are not all bad, but there is a lot of people over liberally applying them and misapplying them. So just keep that in mind. Hopefully this video will keep you out of trouble. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more great content. We will catch you next time.